Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Lynn Jeffrey from the Institute for the Future, and we will get started momentarily. We are really excited this morning. Hello. Nice to see you. We are getting the webinar started. I'm going to share my screen and welcome everyone. My name is Lynn Jeffrey, and I am the director of IFTF Foresight Essentials, which is the part of the Institute where we teach people how to practice foresight and how to think like futurists. And I'm really excited today to have Mark Bamuthi Joseph and Hodari Davis with us for our first Foresight Talks webinar of 2022. I'm going to give you a quick brief on what's coming up at the Institute, and then I'm going to turn it over to our friend Hodari, who will be interviewing Mark. And as always, we will have a conversation with Mark and Hodari, and then we will open it up to audience questions. And a lot of the reason why we have these Foresight Talks is to give you access to visionaries and leading futures thinkers to understand and learn more about how they actually do what they do. So a quick reminder of the different kinds of trainings that we have at the Institute. If you're interested in training, you might want to check out our classes for individuals, design futures, scenario building, our flagship basic course in futures, our Coursera classes, self-paced and self-guided, and then our trainings and courses for all kinds of organizations. We also have our webinars, monthly meetups. We have a newsletter. We have buddy matches if you're interested in meeting someone else from around the world who might be interested in the same futures things that you are. We will connect you. We've already connected over 75 pairs of people. And just in case you're interested in the trainings, these are the ones coming up. We're actually kicking one off, the first one of the year, next week. The March class will be optimized for our European and East Coast folks. And then we have scenario building, design futures, and fast futures, which is a really fun class with Jane McGonigal, 90 minutes. You might want to check that out if you're looking for something new and some futures games really to play. So in case you didn't remember, the only important thing to remember in Zoom is that you want to make sure when you chat, and we welcome you to chat, that you have selected all panelists and attendees and not just hosts and panelists, because if you do that, not everyone will see your chat. We would love to see you as you join. Please do let us know where you're located, introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to, and then put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A as we go along. We'll be collecting those and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. With that, I want to turn it over to our friend Hodari Davis, an intellectual futurist, poet, and a gifted teacher who we are really blessed to have working with us at the Institute for the Future. Hodari's work has focused on youth development, anti-racism, decolonial education, future foresight, and African-American children. He is well known for being the executive producer of the renowned Youth Poetry Festival, the Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam. And as Chief Innovation Officer at Edutainment for Equity, Hodari and his wife work with schools and companies, government agencies, all kinds of organizations to really bring together a kind of blend of entertainment, technology, and art, and challenge common approaches. He is, as I said, a faculty member in Institute for the Future and a third-year doctoral student in the UC Davis School of Education. Hodari, I am going to ask you to introduce our guest who we're really excited about. Welcome, Mark. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Greetings. Welcome to this conversation. Really excited to be having this talk with renowned poet, dancer, writer, Vice President, and Artistic Director of Social Impact at the Kennedy Center, for performing arts. My name is Hadari. As Lynn said, I'm a Foresight Essentials faculty member, Futures Fellow at the Institute. I do a bunch of other things. I'm also a partner and Chief of Innovation Officer at Edutainment for Equity. Look us up. We do a lot of work around professional development, anti-racism, and organizational development. We're located where I'm speaking to you now. So I'm speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Ohlone people in the Confederated Nation of Lashaun, also known as Oakland, California. I always acknowledge the indigenous people's land from which I am speaking. And so that's what that is. And I encourage you to do the same. I'm really excited to be here with you this morning. We're here to have a conversation, not just about some innovative work, but also to interrogate the future through the lens of arts, examine the future through the lens of culture. Oftentimes cultural equity is spoken of as an add-on to the future that we're crafting rather than the core. So it's my hope that this conversation will shed light on some of the practices and pedagogy of cultural futuring and its implications on all futures. Pluriversity is an assumption in this conversation. Pluriversality is an assumption in this conversation. We will not be spending our time justifying the work or the idea of Afrofuturism. Rather, we'll be sharing insights and models of the work that Afrofuturists do to shed light on the depth and value of multiple perspectives and approaches to visioning the future, especially the value of what I refer to as futures centered around the idea of Black joy. And so with that, I want to welcome my brother, Mark Bamuthi Joseph, to the screen. There's so much I could say about who he is, what he's done, all he's accomplished, but I think the best way to begin is to ask him to bless us with a poem. So we're going to start the conversation with a poem. And as you listen to this poem, and of course, you're going to get caught up in the words and the artistry, but I really want you to think and remember that this is methodology that we're talking about. This is something about this Medu will serve as a foundation to our conversation. And so with that, let's welcome Mark Bamuthi Joseph. Some questions of value.
Peace, everyone. Thank you, Hadari, my brother. Thank you, Institute for the Future, for having me. I greet you from the unceded territory of the Nunanchuk and Piscataway people. As Hadari said, this is called Some Questions of Value. What if dignity were currency? And our business model depended on spinning the capital of dignity into the capital of finance. What if when we said equity, we didn't mean everybody's in the house, we meant equity, like what you got if you own your house, invested in inclusion to produce equity for diverse communities, which means more than putting on shows or producing symbols. Though the matter of Black life itself is controversial, surely Black dignity couldn't be cause for alarm. What if all this dis-ease was a prompt for an entrepreneurial reframe, like the explosion of crypto as currency? What if we treated the art of cultivating dignity as an intentional economy? If the product were empathy, and you had to make it, and you had to make it mass accessible, what raw materials would you use? What if dignity were currency and the raw material to make it was culture? What if you worked at a cultural mint and you printed white walls and bright lights and the aesthetic sublime 80% of the time, but 20% of every dime was spent minting cultural equity for the historically left behind? Equity, not like proportional balance, equity like profit on your P&L balance. Who in this country is manufacturing empathy? Just a little bit. And in the end, wouldn't we all benefit? What if dignity were medicine, were a vaccine, and the public and private sector teamed up to invest in our collective healing, and our country's cultural mints were the place where anybody could get pricked with a sharp edge of culture, a chemical boost, included us all, because we've just learned that if I'm healthy and you're sick, I'm at risk. Why risk emerging from this moment in a culturally unhealthy way? Why put a cultural inflection point to waste? What if the product were collective healing? And in order to do it, we had to produce more cooperative economics, except no one would buy it if it wasn't fly. So to heal, we had to invest in artists, invested in their individual projects, but used artist intellect to mass produce dignity and put as much equity in it as you would a non-fungible token of a digital object. We make value. Diversity is not a stock to be left alone to accrue. Diversity is a paper thin bill you gotta keep stacking or else you're not serious. What if you were making a city? How many great artists does it take to make a great city? How many artists does it take to make America great? If you had equity stakes in empathy, who would you invest in first? In the ecosystem of cultural production, what if we all win if we all win? What if we didn't all have to win? We just all remembered when the world was sick and collective healing was something we were all invested in. What if nobody got left behind? What if we healed forward cardinal directions, truth, dimension, humanity, access, latitudes of public imagination, longitudinal public policy, XYZ axis, access the ancestors, call their names, map the future, collective dignity, the moral compass, invest in the road forward, culture as brick, walk the walk. Thank you.
You know, Zoom calls and webinars, you're never supposed to have silence. I'm going to let the claps accrue and people actually take in and, you know, consider what it is that they just heard. What if this was really about dignity? What if this was really about humanity? If the product were empathy, what raw materials would you use? I love that. If the product were empathy, what raw materials would you use? Let's talk about the raw materials. What are the raw materials of empathy, equity, and justice from your perspective?
Joy and sadness, 10,000 joys, 10,000 sorrows. Family. Family. I have to think, Kadari, that any of us that are parents, any of us that are sons or daughters, any of us, I think we want joy for our children. I think we want possibility for our children. I think we want health for the people that raised us. So if that's something that we kind of collectively believe in, at what point in our evolution are those things, are those elements opposing forces for us based on cultural place or ancestral delineation? Do me and Mitch McConnell want the same thing for our kids? And at what point in my son's life does his joy compromise Mitch McConnell's daughter's joy? So I think joy, I think family, I think, you know, the human condition, and art and culture are avatars for the human condition. You know, I trip every time I go to a basketball game that, you know, me and the cat next to me both love the Warriors.
Right.
Working here at the Kennedy Center, you know, you go to the Kennedy Center Honors and it's like, you know, what's Mitt Romney doing here? Mitt Romney likes music? What's Clarence Thomas doing here? You know, Clarence Thomas likes dance. How could Clarence Thomas possibly like dance? And yet here we are at the same place. So I would say that. I would say art as avatar for the human condition and a place of synthesis. That's literally where we can find the laboratory or the incubator for empathetic experiences?
It's really powerful. You know, I last time I was in this conversation with Calvin Williams, we spent a lot of time talking about Afrofutures. And I think that Afrofuturism is like an imperative of the artist that you're talking about, this hope in the future possibility. You can't help but to perceive that thriving is possible, that through this craft, through this technique, through this pedagogy, I'm going to arrive at a moment of real joy, not like false joy, not performative joy, but real joy. And then I think about kind of how we are inundated with hopeless images and ideas, inundated with the idea of pessimism about our future, about future possibility, and how that colors our creativity, how it colors the way that we envision or even dream. What things like equity, anti-racist, they seem so unreachable. They seem like one day I'm going to be rich. You know, they seem like almost fantasy, even though we have a country that's built on the ideology of equity. Those things still seem as far away as, like, I don't know, visiting Neptune or traversing outside of the solar system. It just seems beyond our capacity. So, and that, I think, is because we're inundated with so much pessimism about the possibility, even in the art, even in education, even in the news, like the government, like you just talked about it, like you talked about sitting next to Mitch McConnell or seeing Clarence Thomas. How can you even enjoy the art? Like, how could you sit there and enjoy the art and you're sitting next to Joe Manchin? Like, it's tough.
Well, I'm a firm believer in the adjacent possible. And I think that Neptune is sometimes the enemy or the obstacle for us that are really just trying to get to Selma, or to northernize or easternize Haiti and Jamaica. You know, I think this is something that happens with art all the time. There is not going to be a poem that's going to eradicate white supremacy. There is not going to be a dance that, you know, eliminates violent heterosexism or patriarchy. But a lot of times where we deploy artists is on the margins of these broader social pathologies. And when the artist does the poem that gathers several hundred young people, we have a hopeful ceremonial and symbolic moment. But then we're like, well, you know, those kids that came to that show didn't all graduate from Harvard 3 days later. So what did we really do? And that's an unfair positioning of the artistic experience. But it also lets the social pathologies themselves off the hook. So, for instance, people say to me all the time, what's the role of art in our discourse about cultural equity? When really the question for me is, why isn't our economy more like making art? Why isn't our healthcare system more poetic? Why aren't our housing policies developed more in the line of making theater or making dance? Why aren't those things more collaborative, more inclusive, more improvisational? Why aren't our systems more art-like rather than why, you know, how does art heal our systems?
How can we move artists to become policymakers?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know,
I want to key in a bit. No, go ahead.
Just lastly, like, you know, just on that tip, like hearing you say, you know, art as policymakers, it's like, how many Fortune 500 companies have artists on their boards? How many art institutions have lawyers or economists, et cetera, you know, on their boards? If you took all the boards of all the Fortune 500 companies that were run by white men out of the United States economy, what would the United States economy look like then? how do we think about leadership in the economic sector and the technological center um, as a way into thinking about what future leadership looks like, and how do we think about the economic sector with artists who, deployed as futurists, shape these powerful economic and technological institutions. I think that just in overall, we need to think about the paradigm and the relationship between art, economy, technology, and the future a little bit differently.
Yeah, I feel like artists are sequestered from those official conversations. They're often invited as window dressing, sing this song at the beginning, do the little wrap up at the end. But when we have the meat and potatoes and we're putting stuff on charts and building systems, sit and watch, you observe, give us comments, ask us questions, but not really do what it is that you're most trained to do, which is innovate and and transform.
Yes.
So I think that's interesting. That brings me a little back to this word equity and this performance. So I feel like equity is really resonant in contemporary times, especially after the murder of George Floyd. The aftermath around racial justice, like so many people were confronted with this alternative future. Right? It ran against the ideals that they had of the country. It ran against the myth that we've been told about the country's evolution beyond race. This myth that the civil rights movement won, that Dr. King somehow won whatever the fight that he was engaged in, even though we know in fact that he was assassinated, and that he actually was assassinated 2 days after talking about not yet having reached his dream. So clearly that's not a victory, but anyway, we're caught in this myth, and then we're confronted with George Floyd or Ahmaud or Breonna. And since then, equity and anti-racism and culture and diversity have become buzzwords, performances for many.
Yeah.
And there's been backlash against them. It's been swift, but what is this performance that we're seeing in these institutions, and who are they performing for? Who are they performing for? And to me, this question goes to what you were talking about in your poem. What is the performance of equity? What future is that crafting for people?
These are great questions. Hadari, I'd like to maybe share a little bit of work that I'm doing at the Kennedy Center as a response to that question. As you're setting this up, my title at the Kennedy Center is Vice President and Artistic Director of Social Impact. The Kennedy Center is a 50-year-old organization named after the 35th president, opened up in 1971. So we're in our 50th anniversary season right now. I'm a native New Yorker. I went to school in Atlanta. I became a father in the Bay Area. So in a lot of ways, I feel like I was reborn in California, which is where I spent the majority of my adulthood. I now live in Washington, D.C., bugged out place. And one of the things that I inherit as I take on this role here at the Kennedy Center are two prominent classical music organizations. The Washington National Opera and the National Symphony Orchestra are both resident companies at the Kennedy Center. When I first moved to the Kennedy Center in 2019, I proposed something called the Cartography Project. It took a long time and kind of the straining of some political will for those resident organizations to adopt the Cartography Project as an actual program. What I want to share with you is a trailer, and hopefully after the trailer, I can use this example to talk about or to respond to your question about the performance of equity and how do we move these cultural conversations in a way that's future facing.
Let's do it.
All right.
It's all we have. I think it's the thing that everyone tries to take away from us. Historically, people have tried to take away and have taken away, our homes, our lives, our livelihoods, our future. And all we've really had to cling on to is our dignity.
Map making and magic. Black girl lost in thought, wrapping her head around the direct line from a police stop in traffic to something tragic. Daybreak on a floating man-made island. A mass of history set apart from the manifest destiny of cultural equity. Somebody gotta chart the course, build the bridge composed of the brick of Black dignity and Black sacrifice, map it to scale. Legend, easy to understand, a guide for travelers who believe we all should walk upright. We had several commissions. Each commission was specific to a particular city. The whole idea of cartography is that we're mapping these incidents and we're mapping possibility.
I think that we have a duty and a responsibility to continue paving the way. I think it's kind of the only thing that we know how to do.
As a Black man writing for the orchestra, going against the grain.
In choosing the commissioned artists, we're not really drawing a map, we're drawing dots. A map tells you how to get between the dots. And it also tells you how to move beyond the dots. Somebody has to chart the course forward.
All we know how to do is continue fighting for liberation. All we know how to do is to be ourselves. All we know how to do is to be trailblazers and to be magnanimous as a people. And so it's inevitable that the field is going to change, creating our own places. I hope that it allows. For what? It's not my job to determine. But for whom? Us.
So the cartography project is a pipeline project, is a commissioning project, and is an equity project of the National Symphony Orchestra and the Washington National Opera. What we said was that we want to map Black dignity by first identifying places where there have been iconic transgressions against Black dignity. So Breonna Taylor killed in Louisville, Tamir Rice killed in Cleveland, Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Nia Wilson in Oakland, California. Who are the young composers? Who are the Black composers and librettists 40 years and younger from those places? And can we then commission those composers and librettists to create works inspired by this idea of Black dignity? So the first aspect is the pipeline project, asking who. In our broader conversation about cultural equity, we don't talk enough about pipeline. We don't ask ourselves questions about the relationship between our institution and young children of color. How do we incentivize the sharing of epistemologies between our cultural leaders or our organizational leaders and children of color, for instance, right? So first, let's rethink the pipeline. Second, let's commission these works. And you met some of the librettists and composers, from the Twin Cities to Aurora, Colorado, that have been implicated in this work. And then the third aspect, and this is key to your question, Hadari, is the equity piece. Because we recorded all of these works with members of the National Symphony Orchestra, members of the Washington National Opera. We're going to start rolling out episodes on February 1st that give us a glimpse into these recordings. But we are also working with 8 visual artists to create NFTs inspired by these works. Because we are here at the Kennedy Center, we have a very powerful development team and a really, crazy powered and leveraged board of directors. And so when we put these NFTs at auction on April 4th, we're going to auction 88 of them and set the floor at $10,000 per NFT. 20% of the resources from the sale of the NFT is going to go to the librettists. that created the work. 20% is going to go to the composers. 20% is going to go to the visual artists who created the digital objects. 20% of the resources are going to go to the families of Rayshard Brooks and Nia Wilson and Breonna Taylor and Philando Castile and Eric Garner and Freddie Gray and Elijah McClain and Nia Wilson. And then 20% goes to admin costs. It would be one thing for an organization to respond to Black indignity by like creating pieces for folks to perform. It's another thing to create an instrument to give Black artists, Black organizations, and impacted Black families equity through something like an NFT, which, whose value is volatile according to the market. But by setting the floor, we know that about $20,000, $25,000 will go to the Nia Wilson Family Foundation or scholarship named for Freddie Gray at Coppin State University or the Philando Castile Foundation. And that's the thing that our organizations are not doing. I want to separate in your question as we transition the word performance from the word equity, the word performance from the word allyship. We can perform equity, but you can't perform before you practice. You can perform allyship, but you can't perform allyship unless you practice it. And the ways that we're practicing equity and the ways that we're practicing allyship is to actually generate resource for these impacted communities. That way, it's more than kind of diversity as a show or performance. It's the practice of generating capital, generating financial and equity capital for these communities that actually makes the performance have any kind of value at all in this conversation.
Yeah, I hope that folks are out there taking notes. First of all, we're talking to Mark Bamuthi Joseph. He's dropping gems about how our institutions can not just act like we're diverse or act like equity is something that's important to us. And what really resonated with me with what you just said was that you can't perform without practice. So it's like, you don't do a show without rehearsal. That's just basic artistic practice. You don't publish a book without writing drafts. You don't rip your first freestyle of a poem, you edit it. So this is just it's like an emphasis on the process. And I think a lot of times that performance is like a rush to the outcome. And the outcome is like what I think other people want to see or what I think other people want to hear, rather than it really emerging from consistency with regard to our own internal practices, consistency with regard to our own internal relationships. I think that a lot of times, and this is like leaning a little bit on Kamara Jones' analysis of racism, but a lot of times when people hear racism, they jump to the interpersonal and they kind of turn their back on the institutional and systemic. And what I like about what you said, it almost disregarded the interpersonal, and it actually placed an emphasis on crafting a future based on an institutional focus, a systemic focus. And then you said about, and I wrote this one down, you talked about beginning the cartography project by thinking about children and children of color. And to me, and this is, you and I have been doing this work for decades. So to me, when you center these conversations around young people, particularly around young people of color, especially in the context of cartography or mapping, just what comes up to me is the census and like 2040, 2050, 2060. And these are the young people who are actually going to be the citizens of the country. These are actually the people who are going to carry the ideal and the myth and the practice, good or bad, forward into the future, right? So it's almost like you're mapping the future in a sense, and even through the nodes of these past glories or these past atrocities. I don't know. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Liz, I talk about Washington, D.C. as a strange place. it's also for me, and I can't help but be hopeful. It's a really inspirational place.
Mm.
The idea of democracy itself, as it's ossified in white marble all over this town, is really poetic and visionary. And we are seeing in the present moment insidious practices meant to exile our future citizens from the franchise,
Mm.
to disconnect
Mhm.
the citizens that you speak of, the future of America, from the franchise, which is.
Mhm.
But I want to center, those ideas, those actual people, in this conversation. But I do also want to talk about systemic allyship. And one of the things that I talk about here at the Kennedy Center is that the goal actually is not to be anti-racist. The goal is to be counter-capitalist with an ambition to systemic allyship, which, when I think about systemic allyship, I think about belonging. But I think about pipeline, I think about pedagogy, I think about program, I think about profile. I also think about emotional readiness. I think about acknowledgement and preparedness. I think about forgiveness, and I think about walking in the world as a healed individual or a healed institution. And so the preparation for the future is about crafting in organizational or institutional psychology an emotional readiness that then prepares us to have these broader pedagogical conversations and these programmatic outcomes, recognizing who actually has stakes, who has the most stakes in the future that we want.
Mm.
So this question of, if you had equity stakes in empathy, who would you invest in first? That is a question for the future. If you had equity stakes in democracy, who would you invest in first?
Mm.
These are questions I think that might be asked at the policy level. What we're seeing at the policy level is that there is a certain class of people that has equity stakes in power.
Mhm.
They have equity stakes in hegemony.
Absolutely.
And they are investing, right? So if you had empathy stakes in, if you had equity stakes in empathy or compassion or democracy, who would you invest in? Well, that becomes then a public education conversation. And in my line of work, it's a cultural investment, because equity stakes in democracy means that you invest in the world of ideas and in free thought as much as free speech. The embodiment of healing, which is what music brings, which is what dance brings. My belief here, as I sit in Washington, D.C., is that inspiration is a constitutional right. That if we're going to have conversations about the 14th Amendment and access to the franchise, you cannot be enfranchised in this country unless you have access to inspiration. And so that is the role of the cultural sector, inspiration for all as a constitutional right.
Just forgive me for a second. I have to put that in the chat. I want to transition to questions from audience. There's folks who are just rifling off questions. I want to make sure that we hit them, as many as we can. We'll try to hit them all if we can, but we're not, our intention is not to hit them all. Our intention is to have quality responses and kind of insights on as many as we can get to. That's aligned with where we are in the conversation. So I'm really, this first one I think is really interesting because you just talked about allyship, really what allyship means beyond the performance of allyship. So this is like is it really, is allyship enough to create systemic change? What about co-liberation? Or is that the same thing in your view? That's a question.
Yeah, I think we can play with the nomenclature, but you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I use systemic allyship because what our current paradigm is systemic divisiveness. And this country was not founded on principles of allyship or collegiality or co-liberation. And so most of our institutions were not founded with those things in mind either.
Right.
But, you know, maybe systemic allyship is just, code for co-belonging structures, where we're actually talking about, we are working towards agency in a way that then yields a kind of collaboratively liberatory existence. It's really difficult to I think to have these conversations of institutionality and freedom, but these are design questions.
Yeah,
you know, I say all the time that we've designed a really beautifully effective system in our prison industrial complex. And so if you can design systemic confinement, can you design freedom? And that kind of shatters, you know, the glass that we're currently operating in, which is about institutionality, but it does then speak to a kind of futurity and a kind of design that is psychological, that's aesthetic, that's emotional. But within an organizational context, it's also about orientation and, a kind of mandate within an organization to create structurally the parameters for co-belonging.
Yeah, co-belonging is powerful. I like co-belonging better than allyship. I like the word stakes. You keep mentioning stakes. It's like, what are your stakes in equity? It's a little different than like, do you want to be equitable? This is different. How do you feel about equity? It's different than, do you have a stake in equity? This is a different context for placing that. And I think when you started by saying we could play with the nomenclature, which is a very poet thing to say. You play with nomenclature all the time. That's what you do. You're a master of nomenclature. But for most people, I would say they cannot play with nomenclature. I would say that people get locked into what a word really means, what it means, and then they, or the example or models that they've seen before them about how that word was actualized, and then they just do that. And oftentimes at the lowest level possible. It's like, I want to be able to dunk like, or I want to be able to hit a 3-pointer like Steph Curry, but I know I can't.
Although not recently. What's up?
But I'm gonna keep shooting though. I'm gonna keep shooting. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep shooting, and in my mind, I'm like, Steph, even though it goes in like probably 20-15% of the time. So just to say that it's easier for us to perform based on the models that we've seen before, rather than to innovate something like co-belonging, which requires a new interpretation of my own self in order to belong and allow others to belong as part of me, not as separate from me. It's like not as marginalized from me, but as actually me, you know?
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why, like, new language, why the neologism is our friend here, because we often do get stuck on language and we debate language rather than action or strategy. And so, and Hadar, you know this, like, I like to use new words,
yeah,
or new terms sometimes on the fly. So like, you know, we didn't enter this conversation with the idea of co-belonging, but yeah, let's use that so that we can define it together and shape it together, shape it forward towards a strategic end, rather than debating something that we think we know and spending all of our time kind of rooted in the debate about language rather than rooted in a kind of design imperative towards an equitable future.
I'm getting hit with all these questions. Let me give you this one. Because it goes directly with what we're talking about. If we aim to make our systems look like art or the making of art, could it be socially cohesive? Given that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, what would the equity of art not remain unequal or continue to marginalize already marginalized communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Art practice is different than beauty.
Me too.
Yeah. So yeah, like I am shocked that there's music that people enjoy that like Jay Dilla didn't make or doesn't connect some way to Wayne Shorter. Like I'm shocked when I look at other people's Spotify playlists and Nina Simone isn't at the top. I'm like, what do you mean? You like something other? So yeah, that also is, I think, the beauty of art is that different people appeal to different aesthetics ultimately being what an individual or what a people believe to be good and beautiful and true. But it's actually not what we're talking about here. We're talking about art practice and the qualities, the exercises, the characteristics that it takes to make art, which are not divisive, which tend not to be hierarchical, which is not to say that that in the casting, particularly in commercial situations, the casting has been unequal. You have fewer women directors, let's say. You know, in the film industry, you have you know, kind of fewer Asian folks as you know, lead composers in the classical music industry, and you know, and so forth. The inequity in the casting of commercial art production mirrors the inequity of our society. But what I'm talking about is what it takes to make a play. And the analogy that I'm looking for is, can we take the same elements that it takes to make a play to also craft an economy or to craft a healthcare system? Where is the artistic or design thinking in how it is that we situate or configure these institutions that undergird the entire society? And to that end, where is the artistic leadership inside of board structures, inside of leadership structures of these organizations that then, you know, set the course for these other, you know, aspects of the social matrix? So, you know, whether these things inevitably end up as unequal is more about the human disposition, but the composition of those institutions themselves could use a little more creativity. And the casting of artist intellect and creative intellect in the shaping of these paradigms themselves.
Yeah, we could talk about this for a whole hour, you know, especially as a doctoral student in the School of Education. What I read is boring. You know, the lectures that I sit through are not inspiring. Not that my professors aren't tight. I love my professors, but they're not inspiring. It's not like I'm seeing a play or I'm hearing a poem, and I'm wondering where the innovation, creativity, and sort of beauty of education has gone, how it has been buried in nomenclature and acronyms and official kind of dogma and political fear, all these other things that have just left it kind of obscure. I feel like scholars speak to scholars, they don't speak to the people. Practitioners speak to practitioners, they don't speak to the scholars. And all of that is about nomenclature, language. And so when I hear you say, we need more artists in these positions, I don't hear you saying, we need to replace all the white people in these positions. I think there's an assumption that white people aren't artists too. And I just want to say that every system and institution that exists in the United States has been crafted by white people who were artists, whether they call themselves that or not. Mm-hmm. It's an art to craft what was crafted as the United States and the institutions that keep it. That is an art. It's not like science. It was an ideal philosophy that they try to actualize. And this whole conversation about moving towards a more perfect union or whatever, even though I don't want to make this such a US-centered conversation, but I think globally we kind of position ourselves around these official futures and these formalized systems as if they weren't designed by artists, as if because you are leader of a country, you're not an artist, or because you're a senator, or because you're a parliamentarian or an MP, that you're not an artist. But actually, every bill you craft is art. Every economic policy you make is art. It impacts people's lives. It does harm. Sometimes you allow the harm to be done and you keep it moving because the benefits outweigh the harms, So I just think that, we, as you as an artist, pure, offering new language to analyze things that we've been talking about for a long time, there's magic there, right? And that's the magic that you're referring to, putting an artist in that conversation that artists have otherwise been, or at least artists of color in particular, artists whose positionality is not that of the hegemony, that their critiques and their innovations are going to offer something new and perhaps something that's inspiring. Yeah, I mean, you said walking in the world as a healed individual or institution. What does the practice of healing look like in this context?
I know I keep going back to system and design, and I think that that's probably because I do work within an organization and I have to make the poetry actionable. So I talk about, and let me just put in the chat, in my consultative work, I talk about emotional readiness. I talk about safety. I talk about emotional readiness. And I talk about 4 Ps in terms of this, allyship or systemic allyship or systemic co-belonging. But the emotional readiness comes first. The first thing I think required in healing is acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, not like I did something, but acknowledgement like I live in a house. I inherited a house and the basement is flooding. And I'm not gonna ignore the fact that the basement is flooding because I didn't flood it. I live here. And if I don't address what I inherited, then I'm gonna drown, my thing is gonna rot, the thing is gonna fall apart. So acknowledgement. And right after acknowledgement, I think is a kind of readiness to let go. How many of us have forgiven someone but didn't mean it? So how do you both acknowledge a thing is happening and also not, or acknowledge that a thing has happened, that we exist in a particular realm of cultural stasis, without letting that be the defining characteristic of how it is that we're going to move forward? Being ready to let go means that you're ready to forgive. But once you've forgiven, you can't walk around like it didn't happen. Which any of us that's been in a relationship have all been forgiven by our partners And in some cases, anybody that's been in a relationship, they've forgiven their partners, but not really. So, right? So it's like you acknowledge, you let go, you forgive, and then you walk in the world as a healed person. And all of that requires intention. And I think these are just elements of our business practices. Even what we're experiencing right now in the pandemic, this rush to jump back into a pre-pandemic or to an economy that feels like it's, a pre-pandemic reality, ignores the other reality that we have not engaged in public healing, that we have created infrastructure for health, masks and vaccines and so forth, but we have not designed an infrastructure for healing from the trauma that we are all presently experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a show the other night looking for someone, and I couldn't find them because we all had masks on.
Mm-hmm.
That's about health infrastructure. But in order to heal with the person, some other kind of infrastructure needs to be in place.
Mm-hmm.
So I think public healing, systematizing how we think about health and healing and using culture as a prompt and device to get to that infrastructure for public healing is really what I'm talking about in terms of healing forward. And that's something that we do in this retreat. I also noticed that someone had a question about the poem that we led with today, and I'm going to find that and put it in the chat as well.
What? You're going to find what?
The poem. I have a recording of that poem.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Drop that. Okay, so we're at the 5-minute mark. And so much has been said. So many powerful things have been said. I guess I want to give you an opportunity, I don't know, to charge us with something like, what's the call, right? What's Mark Bamuthi Joseph's call for the future? For those of us who are present here to hear it, what's our marching orders?
We talked a lot about, I think, all these things. We talked a lot about kind of the core components, but I just go back to cultural design and the relationship between culture and social design, not as a symbolic feature of our cultural design, but as a central component. I started, I think, also by saying how the Kennedy Center was celebrating its 50th anniversary. Maybe what we're focused on more than the last 50 years is the next 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Truly thinking about the next 50
mm-hmm.
and where that lands, or where that could land in terms of art and art practice. So my charge, I guess, for this group is to bring an artist onto your board. my charge is to deploy design thinkers who are invested in equitable futures as leaders of your organizations, your corporations, your formal structures. That there's something there, and maybe to return to the poem that I shared, to think of in the same way that we are making value in so many different places, in non-traditional ways, really thinking about value in the cryptocurrency space, to reposition value in a new way, and to use art and artists as the primary resource for how it is that we're thinking about this work.
I love it. Lynn, how you feeling?
I'm I was just taking my notes and echoing the words in the chat. Really inspiring, thoughtful, thought-provoking, and we do share the recording of this, Bamuthi. So if you're okay with that, we would make it public, and we'll send it to all the folks who came and showed up. And yeah, I mean, would love to continue these conversations. Hodari, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you, both of you. And I had a lot more questions. We'd love to continue the conversation about what the next 50 years looks like. That's the space that we like to play in. And want to just thank everyone for attending, and encourage you to come to the next upcoming talks, which are wildly diverse. We have some design futurists coming on in a couple of weeks from Mexico City. We have a deep tech venture capitalist working with the European Innovation Council, talking about his taxonomy of technologies. So please do go to the Foresight Talks website page. Aicha, if you can grab that and put it in the chat, that would be wonderful. Again, thank you so much. And we will continue to be continued.
Continued. Right on. Thank you, Mark. Thank you this morning. I don't think I've ever called you Mark in my whole life. Mark, Joseph, thank you.
Hadari Biono Davis, man, all 3 names, bruh. It's another Black tradition. 3 days.
3 names. On a roll with
Earl Jones, Billy D. Williams.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. And, I know you got a lot going on in DC between writing plays, operas, dancing, writing poems, and managing an entire facility on behalf of the United States of America. So we thank you. We thank you for your hour.
Yes.
Right on. I put the poem in the chat. I put Heal Forward in the chat. We'll see you there. Thank you so much.
All right.
Hadari, I love you, brother. Thank you, man.
Peace.
All right. Peace.